Do you remember RPGs? And I don't mean this type of RPG, but this type of RPG. In the modern gaming climate, things have gotten pretty disappointed for fans of this genre, as focus has shifted ever so slightly in a completely different direction. Every game these days feels like it's turned into a free-to-play battle royale, or must have the most openest world of all time to compete with the likes of Skyrim or Breath of the Wild, or they try and copy and paste the Souls formula and make combat an assortment of dodge rolling, praying, and tri-finger butthole. In the Stone Ages of the 1990s/early 2000s, however, gaming looked a lot different than it does now. I mean, literally. Is this supposed to even be a person? What am I looking at here? What I mean to say is that games had a different feel to them. Games like Final Fantasy VI, the OG Fallout games, KOTOR, and one that has recently re-entered the spotlight, the Baldur's Gate series. Now, Baldur's Gate 3 has made monumental waves across the gaming world within the past year or so. One of the reasons being that you can sleep with a bear within the first few hours of the game, every nerd's dream. It has won countless awards, Game of the Year titles, and firmly placed Belgian company Larian Studios as one of the quintessential good guys of the industry, and someone to keep an eye out for with future releases, all while competing with some of the biggest AAA gaming releases within a year. With some of the conversations around the game, Baldur's Gate 3 must have been some of the most incredible work of gameplay performance to have achieved such accolades, right? Well, I would say no. Baldur's Gate 3 did not reinvent the wheel, as it were, or change our perception of gaming as we know it. Frankly, at this point in time, I'm not sure if that's possible. What they did do is what all companies should do with their new releases, is that they looked at the wheel and decided they were going to fine-tune the shit out of it and make it the best goddamn wheel their company could ever create. And to do that, they did something that a lot of developers have seemed to avoid like the plague recently, which has also caused the decline of the traditional RPG. Larian made a real and compelling multi-layered narrative, the heart of a true masterful RPG, and have overall shown these signs of life for this genre of gaming. So before I get into all of that though, I know I said the gameplay wasn't groundbreaking, so let's talk about it. What I fundamentally was referring to is the meat of the game, and also for most RPGs, which is the combat. Now, D&D is the granddaddy to gaming as we know it, so combining the direct 5e rule set, the setting, and fundamentals in terms of character structure and abilities into a turn-based fantasy RPG is just an easy way to print some money. It was really funny to see the reactions and comparisons between Spider-Man 2 and Baldur's Gate's gameplay when Baldur's Gate 3 won Game of the Year, because yes, in reality, this shit looks boring as hell. Like, what do you mean I have to read about my abilities and what they do and how they will affect not only the enemies around me, but also my party members? Big Wheel is attacking New York. At least with Baldur's Gate, these dudes that threatened to eat me earlier are now showing up to literally lay down their lives for people they have known for all of a couple of seconds.
How regrettable that your meat must go unsavored.
The turn-based CRPG format is a staple of some of the most revered games of all time, and Larian already made Divinity Original Sin 2, one of the best modern turn-based RPGs, which, frankly speaking, is not a whole lot different from this game from a combat perspective. And while people say that Divinity Original Sin 2 is a great game, it does not get the ass-kissing that Larian's new release does. And it's not like using the D&D rule set dramatically changes anything for the gameplay either. This has practically been baked into the Baldur's Gate franchise since its inception. I wouldn't say that Baldur's Gate 3 contributed a fresh set of mechanics, but they instead smartly implemented and focused on what works for this type of game. Strategic movements, boss phases, getting your ass kicked by invisible people you can't fucking see, the classics of the genre that make combat feel fresh and dynamic, keeping you engaged while you get to the heart of the reason why you keep playing, the story motivation behind your actions. I think one of the most interesting facets to Baldur's Gate 3 is that it doesn't feel like the world is revolving around your character. Things are constantly going on in the background, and you are constantly having information and histories discussed with you, as if you're not someone who shapes history, but much like a real person, you are being shaped by history and previous encounters that we don't see portrayed on screen. There is so much going on here that it makes you genuinely curious as to how the world got to such a dire state. To stumble upon a journal in a random area to find out why there are corpses strung about, to learn about the history of the Githyanki and why they are such pieces of shit, especially to their own people. It makes you feel a part of something bigger, which feels more relatable, and you can put that down simply to good writing. But I think it's actually about good writing structure. Having the game set in an already pre-established world as Dungeons & Dragons, and having source material with the previous two Baldur's Gate titles, makes it so that the writers for Baldur's Gate 3 don't have to establish the why you should care about this world motivations, or pay too much attention to world building within their storylines. They can focus on displaying and fleshing out unique concepts that are derived from the larger world's surrounding narratives. I'll give you two examples to flesh this difference out a bit, because I know I might not be making a whole lot of sense right now, and I'll also use two new IPs to exemplify this: The Outer Worlds and Elden Ring. Now, Obsidian is a beloved studio when it comes to RPGs, and it brings me no pleasure to talk down one of their games, but The Outer Worlds is not Obsidian at their best, not even close. A lot of people point to the gameplay just not being punchy enough, because I mean, no one would challenge Obsidian's storytelling, right? I mean, just look at these dialogue options, man. Compare that to Fallout 4's system, and this shit looks like Game of the Year level.
If you're here to talk me into working on Liberty Prime, you can forget it. Do I need to remind you why you made that promise in the first place?
No, that won't be necessary. Tell Proctor Ingram to get her scribes ready.
And don't get me wrong, there is good writing in this game, but on par with Obsidian's other titles, especially across the entire game, absolutely not. Your character rolls out of cryostasis, yet it feels like the world that you have been dropped into is still waking up alongside your character. What was the world like before you went into cryo? Did you know anybody who's frozen alongside you? Is my character not a bit shell-shocked from waking up in a different time in a different area? The answers are never really given to you, nor are you expected to care, as your character is just some random-ass person the scientists picked out of a hat that just happened to turn out to be a one-person army capable of deconstructing these massive corporations. You are fully shaping how this world evolves, and it makes you feel like an anomaly. Making a player roleplay as an outlier is a strange game decision, as the player will internalize those feelings towards the game while they are the one playing through the story. And I put this down to Obsidian having to focus so heavily on building the world while simultaneously building their game's story, as they just constantly feel like they're overlapping more than they should. Hopefully now that they won't have to focus as much on the world building, Outer Worlds 2 will go down a lot more of an expansive route. When Obsidian had made games for pre-established IPs, you get shit like KOTOR 2 or Fallout New Vegas. Games that took beloved franchises and made unique stories that blow the original source material out of the water. But this is a fresh IP, so they were always going to be doomed to make these sort of mistakes, right? Well, bring in a game like Elden Ring. Now, a lot of people compound Dark Souls and Elden Ring together because, let's be honest, Elden Ring is just an extension of Dark Souls and FromSoft's formula. But the story has always been considered distinctive, so let's talk about it. Now, Miyazaki set out to make a game that was a lot more open world than Dark Souls, but also a lot more accessible from a narrative perspective than these Souls games. George R.R. Martin was hired to create the world's story from scratch, which probably ate up most of the 5-year development time if the Game of Thrones books are anything to go by. And once the surrounding world narrative was created, Miyazaki was called back into the room to design the plot of the game, with the game devs in charge of making it all come to life. Now, making a game that is more accessible story-wise than Dark Souls is like being told, instead of walking barefoot across broken glass, you can wear shoes this time. It's helpful, but still isn't easy. Elden Ring is still cryptic because you don't often see the world state as it was beforehand. Instead, it is often described to you. The difference, though, comes from the intention, and you are still at least given some information about the questions you may have. You are given bits and pieces of Melina's story through a lot of environmental storytelling. She's in the opening cinematic, and you find her statues popping up through a bunch of different locations. And Millicent's quest parallels Melina's experience with the rot and references her influence in the world. So when you finally come face to face with this red-haired tragic hero that you've heard bits and pieces about, you still immediately feel the weight of this battle as you face a titan of this decaying world that you're trying to restore. And it also doesn't hurt that you get your shit kicked in for the next hour and a half and start throwing your controller against the wall. World building is important, but building your world while you build your narrative is like trying to work 2 full-time jobs at the same time. Keep them separate and weave them together fluently. If you try and build them at the same time, you're gonna get confused and they're gonna overlap in weird ways. Baldur's Gate 3 does an excellent job of capitalizing on the game's world to develop a fun and engaging story. It motivates you to get to the bottom of the larger plot that is in the works here. So instead of yapping about how great the story is, maybe I should go over what it is exactly that I like about it. I will bare bones the intro for you, but there will be a little bit of spoilers. You wake up on an alien ship with the visual of an alien stuffing a slug into your eyes with demons and dragons and shit attacking all around, and you try and find your way off of the ship while avoiding getting killed by all the high amounts of ungodly monsters that are lurking around every corner. And once you make your escape, you realize you have been infected, and you are told that you will turn into one of the squid men you bumped into earlier. With the fear of losing control over your body and mind, you now set out to find a cure that leads to uncovering a massive cult plot coordinated by tyrannical gods that are on a path to dominate the world as you know it. The thing that envelops me into this world is the actual role you can play within this role-playing game. Surprising, I know. One of my favorite aspects of some of Larian's titles is the usage of origin characters. You can play as a fully voiced, fully plotted out character with their own backstory and character arc. Or you can choose to be a Tav and build your character from the ground up. Picking an origin character is great if you like preset motivations. If you pick a character like Shadowheart, for example, your motivations and driving factors for your contributions to the narrative are pretty clearly spelled out for you. And the game allows for you to directly influence how muddy the devotion to your deity turns out to be, which is super interesting from a narrative perspective. I typically like to build my own characters, but if you haven't done a Dark Urge run, I really recommend it. I started out on an honor mode run, which shortly ended after the Adamantium Forge fight. If you know, you know. The story also completely bends to how you act as a player. If you skip side content and stick to the main story, you'll have a different experience and ending than a player that accomplished every single quest and small task. The thing I love though is the actual weighted impacts of the decisions you make within the game, especially in those side plots I mentioned. If you decide to attack certain characters or side with certain people, the reactions you receive will result in different outcomes, whether it be you missing out on a reward, a companion leaving your party, or someone saving your life in a dire moment, all by following a particular route. Sometimes these choices will even leave you questioning whether you made the right call down the line, when it isn't often clear what the right or wrong or good or evil choices are. It makes replaying the game from a different perspective a constant, oh, so that's what happens type of experience, which feels really rewarding and keeps the game feeling fresh.
What in the sweet hells were you thinking? Activating that lot? I was right there!
You can be selfish, you can be righteous, you can be an idiot, or you can be an absolute monster. The game morphs itself based off how you play, like a game about role-playing always should. The standout greatest part of this game though is the companion characters and party mechanics. Dragon Age Origins always gets propped up as a game where the side characters are near perfectly written, and I genuinely think Baldur's Gate 3 makes that game look like it came out in prehistoric times with how gripping your party members are, and the emotional connection you build with each of them. From a gameplay standpoint, you can structure them however you want regardless of how the narrative props them up. Gale is heavily linked to being a wizard, but you can make him a fighter class if you want to. Just makes it a little weird when he talks about casting magic and he isn't able to cast any in battle. And from how challenging the combat can be, especially on honor mode, you build a bond with characters that get you out of a tight spot. I always ran Astarion as a rogue ranger multiclass, which, by the way, if you aren't multiclassing, you're missing out. And the amount of times that I would just decimate an entire room before the rest of my party can even show up was incredible. But let's get to the actual meat of these characters. As I kind of hinted at, all of your party members are the origin characters that come with their own personal histories and motivations. And every character you can recruit has a direct tie to the main story of the game, making companion quests and the main story blend together ever so smoothly. I'm going to highlight 3 characters that I personally enjoyed the story progression of the most. Starting off with Lae'zel, she is the first character you meet on board the Nautiloid, and extremely cold-blooded in terms of leaving a trapped Shadowheart behind. She almost immediately threatens to kill you and herself due to her culture's stance on illithid infection. She's aggressive, disciplined, proud of her race, and extremely honest to a self-destructive degree. I've seen in discussions that players often kill Lae'zel or didn't interact with her much due to her abrasive demeanor. And honestly, who wants to be talked down the entire time they talk to somebody in a video game? I may as well work a retail job at this point. But if you stick with her, you get to see some of the most unique character progression in any video game. Lae'zel is, as you can tell, a Githyanki, a race of warriors from the astral plane that hunt their former masters, the Mind Flayers. They also have really efficient noses, as Lae'zel points out. She is very much a product of her people. Half the time you ask her questions about herself, the things she enjoys or the experiences she's had, her response generally involves how her people are, that her people enjoy being strong. They kill those within their race that are weak, and you are lucky that the Gith do not set out on a path to destroy the world as you know it, because they would flay everybody alive. Which is also really funny when you walk into a creche and body every single Githyanki in there, but I digress. For a little bit of a stretch comparison, they're essentially Viltrumites, where she has been indoctrinated into believing that her race are the only race that matters, and her own personal wants and wishes are not a factor. She must be efficient, she must be deadly, and she must never question the directives made by her queen. Well, Baldur's Gate does a great job of taking characters like this, that are so firmly rigid in their beliefs, and does its best to flip them all upside down. First, Lae'zel believes her people can cure the Mind Flayer infection. And so once you get down to a creche and speak with the supposed expert, the device that's supposed to cure you is not actually set up to help the infected, but to kill them and extract the illithid sample. And then you meet the ruler of her people, Vlaakith, that sends you on a mission to kill the entity that has been protecting you from being taken over from the tadpole in your head, and Lae'zel pushes you to follow her queen's orders. Regardless of the decision you make, Vlaakith orders her people to straight up murder you once you leave the astral prism. And this is when Lae'zel faces her first moment of internal conflict, the confusion around why someone she dedicated her life to would so easily order her demise. And in this moment, it's really easy to convince Lae'zel that it's just a test from Vlaakith. When you meet with Voss, and he later on tells your party that the traitor to the Githyanki people, Orpheus, was not actually a villain, but someone who stopped the Mind Flayers from accomplishing their grand design, and because he was considered a threat to Vlaakith and her rule, he was imprisoned within the artifact that you're carrying, completely bursts Lae'zel's entire worldview. If you have ever wanted to see the representation of someone having their brain melted, this is it. And you can fully guide whether she falls back into the indoctrination she experiences, or if she actually tries to hear out Voss and to free Orpheus in order to free her people as well. In terms of repercussions, if you keep her on Vlaakith's side, With romancing her, it leads to a really heart-wrenching moment where despite how happy you make her, she has to be fully devoted to her queen, even despite the fact that Githyanki are still being dispatched to kill you on Vlaakith's orders. Whereas, if you allow for her to break out of the brainwashing of her upbringing, she begins to actually start showing signs of her own individuality a lot more. She talks about things as herself more instead of her people. She enjoys the comforts of your world, even though she hasn't really been there for all that long. And if you again choose to romance her, you see a really soft, caring side to a character that has threatened to murder you countless amounts of times. And despite hearing that most of the information she has heard her entire life is a lie, the writers don't make her completely change as a character. She still loves and is proud of her people. And her goal changes from serving her queen to freeing everyone from her rule. The transition from being a cold-hearted and relentless character who openly glorifies the killing of children that are weak to the concern she experiences for those who are still being subjugated under her false leader's rule is dynamic, unique, and expertly written. It compels you to push Lae'zel to continue making decisions for herself, instead of following the wishes of others. Another standout character from this game would be Astarion. Neil Newbon's voice acting really helps bring this character to life, so that's definitely part of the reason there has been so much fanfare around him, but his story is genuinely one of the most tragic things in recent media. He starts out very antagonistic, much like Lae'zel, and he'll try and murder you on first approach, much like Lae'zel. He acts very suspect when you run into a dead boar, and tries to manipulate you and your party when you bump into a vampire hunter out in the witch's swamp. His reveal as being a vampire spawn, if you didn't select him as your main character, is well done. You maybe have suspicions about him, but don't have it nailed down until he directly tries to bite your neck while you're sleeping.
Shit.
It makes his whole bravado make a lot more sense. His surprise and enjoyment at being in the sun. Him trying to divert the party in multiple different ways. It's intrigue-building character writing that is super well done. And when he asks if he can sample your blood, and if you allow him to, you have to physically push him off of you, otherwise he will just straight up kill you, showcasing his lack of control of this side of himself, the animal inside such a sophisticated looking person. And prior to this revelation, Astarion doesn't really have much to say to you, giving the indication that he doesn't really trust you. And when dealing with other characters while he's in your party, you build more approval with him when you're dishonest or conniving in some way. When he starts to open up more as the game progresses, you start to see glimmers of the abuse he has undergone throughout his existence as a spawn, the infernal markings etched into his back, the description of being caged and beaten when he acted out or disobeyed, him being practically used as an object to attract the vulnerable to his master Cazador. You aren't seeing a confident elitist who thinks he is better than everybody else. You see a wounded animal that has only ever known being powerless, doing his best to disguise and bury his pain. And when he learns of Cazador's plot to use his quote siblings to become an ascended vampire, this becomes an opportunity to never be powerless again. His story boils down to being one of recovery. You can choose to help him let go and move forward, or you can feed into his self-destructive tendencies and make him the monster that he was always afraid of. Astarion is an extremely torn character, as he seemingly wants to protect the innocent, but contemplates their sacrifice if it brings him benefit. He still does his best to maintain his confident and arrogant persona through conversations and his comments with your party, but really shows himself in distinctive moments. Like, when at Moonrise Towers, if you decide to allow the Drow to sample his blood, if you're trying to romance Astarion, he cuts you right off then and there for crossing a boundary and making him feel used. If Scratch is killed, which why would you allow that to happen in the first place, Astarion will be the most emotional about his passing.
Can't believe the stupid dog isn't here to get the stupid bull.
And when you get to Cazador's place to stop his scheme, this scene, holy fuck, this scene genuinely extremely fucked up and pushes you even further forward. He's a great character overall, especially from a comic relief perspective, as his comments and bickering with other party members can be quite fun and witty, but as a reflection of real life, those are the types of people who are often in the most need of help. So check in on your friends, dog. The last character I want to quickly mention is Minthara, as I think she gets overlooked quite a bit. I'm not always a fan of bosses in video games becoming allies, as I think it's a little bit of an overused trope, but the fact that if you aren't aware that she can be recruited when you first meet her, if you're looking to side with the Grove/Tieflings, you can straight up kill her and never hear from her or her story again. But if you play as an evil character, you would have a chance to recruit her, which is an excellent system and makes her storyline worth investing into. I straight up killed her in my first playthrough. She gave very typical boss enemy behavior, obsessed with power and serving the absolute. But when I did my second playthrough, knowing now that she was a recruitable character, I had the preconception that she would be a character fully focused on revenge, after being abandoned by Ketheric and the other cultists for her perceived failure. And I was half right, but my thoughts were that her motivations for joining would be solely to see the cult's plans fully fall apart. But from the conversations and interactions you have with her, you see a character that was taken advantage of, manipulated and indoctrinated into fighting for a cause that she didn't believe in, and worst of all, being forced to murder innocents. something against her moral code as a god-fearing paladin. Get one of the most compassionate stories from a character you would never expect to receive one from. And the horror she describes on the day she was given a tadpole, where she watched all of her fellow soldiers get absolutely slaughtered in front of her, really reinforces that everything that we have seen of her so far was not of her own free will. And that simple-minded boss character I met on my first playthrough was not her in control of her own actions. This balance of strength and pride versus moments of weakness and almost tenderness make her an incredibly complex character. One I did not give enough credit to as I magic missiled her to smithereens. I was not in for a revenge story, I was actually witnessing a redemption arc, one that I think is incredibly well done, and worth witnessing yourself if you had missed out on her character in a first playthrough. In fact, Baldur's Gate 3 deserves not just a second, but a third, fourth, or even fifth playthrough, not only to experience the depth of its characters, but to uncover the countless narrative threads woven throughout the game. Each time you play, you'll discover new conversations, hidden dialogue, or subtle story beats that you might have missed entirely. However, replayability isn't the main point here. What truly sets Baldur's Gate 3 apart is how it embodies what all RPGs should aspire to be. Games where your role and choices carry real weight. And I'm going to go back to the point that I made earlier. If you stripped away Baldur's Gate 3's story, you'd essentially be playing Divinity Original Sin 2. And while that game is a fantastic game in its own right, there's a reason these two titles are held in vastly different regards. In Baldur's Gate 3, if you want to call someone an asshole and kill them, you can. If you want to call someone an asshole and let them live, you can do that too. Either way, the game ensures your actions have meaningful consequences. Modern RPGs often fall into the trap of creating the illusion of choice. Dialogue options don't always mean what they say, branching paths frequently converge into the same outcome, and talent trees and upgrades offer little more than superficial variety, usually just a new chess piece after fighting yet another bullet sponge. Too often, the actual story takes a backseat to grind-heavy mechanics and monetization strategies. But Baldur's Gate 3 didn't reinvent the RPG, it simply perfected the core elements of the genre and elevated them to a legendary standard. The game's overwhelming success gives me hope that the industry isn't entirely lost, especially when it comes to RPGs. Larian Studios has emerged as a beacon for developers who still understand what players crave in their gaming experiences, and with the announcement that their next game will arrive in 2028 or 2029, and the assurance from their CEO that it will only release when it's fully ready, we have reason to stay optimistic. Whether it's another entry into the Divinity series or something entirely new, if Larian maintains the same level of quality they displayed with Baldur's Gate 3, they could usher in a new era of RPG dominance. Let's hope they do.